I thought, we could have a pretty interesting model to kind of step in and, I think rethink some of this supply chain from the ground up, which is why we ended up starting Column in 2019. I think if we kind of take a step back and say, hey, we could kind of design this from scratch, we could kind of really go back on first principles, what would we do? If we wanted to provide low-level technical and financial infrastructure for companies to build. Fintech isn't profitable right now. And what you need to do, these fintechs need to do, is they need to control more of the ecosystem.
Hey everyone, I'm Rex, a founder at Cambrian, a community for founders and builders in fintech. Incredibly excited for today's program. Today's guest is none other than William Hockey, the co-founder and CTO of Plaid. In 2019, though, William stepped down from Plaid, and for 3 years, he and a small team worked in stealth on a new company, Column. Today, we're going to talk about that company. William describes Column as a, quote, nationally chartered bank that has built every facet of the technology from scratch. So today, what we're going to cover is what inspired William to start his new venture and why he believes the technology they've built will be critical for the fintech ecosystem as it scales. So very excited to dive in here. Hey, William, welcome.
Hey, Rex, thanks for having me.
So I want to start at the very beginning, 2019. You've been the CTO, co-founder of Plaid. You decide to start something new. What's the inspiration and things you learned at Plaid that led you to wanting to start out on your new venture?
Yeah, totally. So as you mentioned, I started Plaid with my co-founder Zach back in 2012, and it was just an absolutely incredible journey. And Plaid is, I think, still one of the best, if not the best company out there. But I was lucky enough in that process to meet with literally thousands of different companies and startups building kind of across the financial ecosystem in the U.S. and abroad. And I think over time, you start to realize very viscerally the pains of building in financial services in the U.S. And there's some amazing things and some really hard things. We recognize that the supply chain in financial services was getting too long and too complicated. And that had a lot of negative effects. Is one, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a cost perspective and a technology perspective. And I thought, we could have a pretty interesting model to kind of step in and, I think rethink some of this supply chain from the ground up, which is why we ended up starting Column in 2019.
Yeah, and what was the kind of original inklings and maybe some of what you saw customers struggling with over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you kind of look at as fintech evolves, I think the use cases have gotten much more complex. To historically when we were just doing basic things like bill payments or personal financial management, as the industry evolved from kind of 2008 onwards, we got to a point where fintech today is you're building these relatively full-featured financial companies and financial systems from scratch that don't fit into kind of the normal paradigm of a bank. And because of that, as it evolved, I think the underlying infrastructure in order to do that changed and evolved. And I don't think we think that that infrastructure kind of evolved in a relatively productive way. And so kind of, what we start to look at is if you look at it, there was kind of this like sponsor bank middleware vendor model, where you have these banks that are responsible for, the regulatory and compliance obligations. And then they vendor out a majority of their kind of technical obligations to these large core providers like a Fiserv or FIS or Jack Henry. Most of the things that a bank does, like swiping a debit card or sending money or like holding funds or like a website and a mobile app, that is rarely, if ever, actually done by the bank. It's all done by these third-party providers. And that's kind of the way the industry's been for a long period of time. And then what you have is you have these fintechs that, want to go do bank-like activities. And so they need to go find a partner for that. And so then they go to these partners and then these partners, don't really have the technical capabilities to serve them. And so then that also gets outsourced to all of these middleware providers, whether it be these payment orchestration platforms or banks as service providers or whatever you kind of want to call them. And so then you kind of step back and you look at yourself as a fintech and you're like, okay, I want to do something relatively basic. Like, I don't know, hold money and like move money on behalf of my clients. And you have four, five, six, seven vendors upstream of you to do something relatively basic. And each one of them has their own kind of confusing compliance requirements. They all have their own technical compliance. They all charge a lot of money. And so then, 18 months later, maybe you have your product out. And not only is it actually probably unoptimal, you probably can't move very fast and your economics are pretty poor. And we sort of see this happen with a lot of our customers, where I think these relatively basic businesses were just drowned in complexity and we're running these things in margin profiles that just weren't profitable. And I think when I look at this, like fundamentally believe that we need competition in financial services. And fintech is the best way that competition is going to serve consumers and businesses. And so I really think that this industry needs to survive. It needs to be resilient. It needs to be profitable. And just the way it operates right now, it's not.
Yeah.
It's skirting a lot of rules that I think should be followed. And it's working in a revenue model that just is fundamentally unprofitable. And so I thought, after seeing this for, almost 10 years, I was like, I think if we kind of take a step back and say, hey, if we could kind of design this from scratch, if we could kind of really go back on first principles, what would we do? And, that's kind of what we ended up doing with Column.
Yeah, and there's the old adage that in technology, there's kind of two ways of building products. There's unbundling and rebundling. And unbundling is nice because you can pick off individual pieces, you can move quickly, you can serve specific segments of customers, but then you can end up with a high degree of fragmentation, but it still has its place. And then there's rebundling, which is where you come back, you learn from the unbundled structure that there are actually, certain synergies that are hard when everything's, federalized. And so you need to reintegrate. And so I guess that's one of the core things behind Column. But to actually go out and to build like a holistically incorporated infrastructure, you actually need to go and buy a bank and build a tremendous amount of technology. So maybe just talk through a little bit that process of going and kind of thinking about the decision to purchase a bank. And then we can jump from there into kind of understanding the technology and what you guys have built.
So kind of going in, I think we had a relatively narrow focus on what we wanted to do, which is we wanted to provide low-level technical and financial infrastructure for companies to build, financial companies off of. And that is, things like moving money, holding money, and lending money. We don't go very far up the stack, right? So we are not a provider that will do everything for you. We wanted to do a couple things really, really well. But in order to do that, you have to be a regulated entity. Is we needed to be a bank in order to do that. And so, we were lucky enough to go out, meet with a bunch of different institutions, and to find one that we fell in love with that had a great business model, had a great management team, that had a great relationship with the regulators and had no issues. And so, we partnered up with them and purchased them, a few years ago, and kind of in parallel to that. And before that, really started building out this technology.
Yep. And that's NorCal Bank, which has one branch in Chico, California, I believe.
So we bought a bank called Northern California National Bank. It's out in Chico. It's subsequently been renamed Column, but we still operate the branch out in Chico under the marketing name of NorCal. And they're still doing what they were doing before, and they're excellent at that.
And then one thing you've done differently too, in terms of not just buying a bank, but also is the ownership structure is different from other traditional, at least venture-backed companies. So talk through how you think your ownership structure matters in particular in building this level of financial infrastructure.
So I think as we looked at this from an employee and founder perspective, we wanted to make sure that we had 100% of the same interests of not only the regulators, but also our customers as well. And so we took a approach where we believe we can do this well. Like we believe we can do this in a super safe, super technically advanced and really beneficial way for the entire ecosystem, regulators and customers to do it. But in order to do that, we have to take the risk with us. And so we decided to not take any outside capital and run it and self-fund and run as a profitable entity. I think also just from a cultural perspective, I tend to like smaller companies. I tend to like being able to kind of control into my own destiny. And I think what we are doing here is fundamentally different than maybe what the rest of Silicon Valley is. And so we wanted an ownership mentality that allowed us to kind of think in things in, 10, 15, 20, 30-year blocks. And, why venture is amazing, it really, no matter what happens, it really doesn't enable you to think in those kind of those longer term horizons, because you do need to grow at a rate that, achieves reasonable returns for LPs and stuff like that. And I think that is something that we just didn't want to contribute to because we think we're on a very long journey here. And there will be ups and downs, and we'll have to make decisions that maybe aren't good financial decisions, but they are the right decisions from the long term perspective. And we thought this was the best model to do it.
Yep. And so you're 100% employee owned, essentially.
Yeah. So myself and my co-founder, myself and employees, we all own 100%.
Yeah, and it's definitely a different, interesting model. But yeah,
The one thing I'll say, right, is because I've gotten a ton of questions about it, and we get a lot of people email us about our model. Is I 100% don't think it's right for everybody. I think you have to be very confident in your business model. You have to be very confident in your team, and it's not really for the faint of heart. And I think in many ways you have to run it as a profitable entity. And I think we're lucky because the broader bank business model is one that is something that generates revenues relatively quickly, so we can do it. But I even generally don't actually recommend most people to do it. And so I think venture in the broader tech community is an incredible asset. And I think most people, it is the right path for most people. Just for our kind of bespoke use case right now, it's probably not best for us.
yep, yep. And then let's start diving into some of the technology that you guys have built. So one of the things we talked about before, and I'll just quote you here, is that the largest pain point in building financial services and fintech is the supply chain it's built on. There's an unnecessary separation between the chartered regulated bank and the middleware and platform companies that fintechs rely on. So talk through what it's looked like to build out your own technology from the ground up, and then specifically some of the use cases that's unlocked that have been pretty material to your early customers.
Yeah, totally. So I think for us, when we think about a bank, what are they? A bank is in many ways kind of a technical abstraction on top of the Federal Reserve with a lot of kind of compliance tooling built and compliance and risk tooling built around that. You think about what a bank does at its core principle, right? It does three things. It holds money, it moves money, and it lends money out. And the holding money and the moving money, that entirely is really done with the Fed, right? Where in the end, whether
Yep.
you're making a card payment or you're making ACH or wire or something like that, in the day, that is going to be settling between banks. And that is going to be settled through two clearinghouses in the US. One is called the Federal Reserve, and the second one is called the clearinghouse. And so in the end, no matter what happens, like the buck kind of stops up there. And so the first thing you have to do is you have to really understand what that data model looks like, what that abstraction look like, and do a really good job kind of abstracting that. And so that's kind of where we started, right? And so you build really low level technology to integrate with the Fed, and you allow yourself to kind of ledger, understand that from a liquidity perspective, from reconciliation perspective, and build really great abstractions on top of that. And so you can control that. And then you give your developers some onus and control of that as well. And then a lot of the technology is around from a risk and compliance perspective on how we actually managing these developers, how we manage the people building on the system, and making sure we have the right controls perspective to really kind of orchestrate this entire system relatively automatically with a lot of other humans in the loop. And so that's really where we started. And so, what we focus on now is we focus on building kind of these relatively low level primitives and working with sophisticated companies that want to build directly on top of us. And I think where we differ from maybe the larger space is we think that is actually enough to build 95% of the financial services companies are out there. And what we do is we actually put more onus on our customers and actually require them to actually control more of the flow. And so maybe we can talk about two examples here, right? Something like KYC or KYB, which is like as a customer, you have to onboard your users. There's incredible vendors out there, from Socure to Persona to Middesk to LexisNexis to whoever. I'm not going to rebuild that. There's great solutions out there. So I want my customers to pick the best one for them, integrate with them. I'll double click to make sure I like that integration, and then I'll kind of outsource stuff to them. And so that is like a classic example of like historically kind of in the banks as service world, the banks as service provider wants to take all of that responsibility. For us, we're being like, no, we believe in this best of breed approach, which is there are great vendors for all these different point solutions out there. you should go pick the best one for you. We are a point solution for the banking and the Fed side, and we're going to work super
Yep.
close with all these other vendors to go do that. And like, I think what happens over time is my general thesis is fintech isn't profitable right now. And what you need to do, these fintechs need to do, is they need to control more of the ecosystem.
Yeah, and maybe to make it real, I'd love to hear just kind of customer stories, and they can be anonymized or just spoken about in broad strokes about like why someone gets to a certain scale, realize their existing model breaks down, and then how you're able to actually help with something like that. So maybe that's something around faster two-legged ACH processing, like better transparencies into how wires are cleared, or maybe just better pricing for ACH and wires. So like what are some of those things that people come to you, realize they have a problem, and that because of how you've built your solution, it makes a lot of sense for them.
Yeah, so I can maybe kind of give two examples, right? I think the classic example I would bring to the space is like neobanking. And I think what happens is, you want to build out from scratch. And so you want to kind of find somebody to do all of that for you because you don't have the expertise to do that, which makes a lot of sense. So you go build something, you get product market fit. Then you realize a couple of things. You actually have no control over your own destiny. And so kind of like how much economics you get from that card swipe, the onboarding of the customers, the customer experience, the marketing you can do, the marketing of that card design. If you want to do anything that isn't outside of like this little box, you can't do it. And the problem is this little box you get isn't profitable and it's extraordinarily competitive. And so then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to be like, okay, how do I actually bring more of the control in house? And so I can actually onboard the customers for myself, have my own card design, control the economics of that card and stuff like that. So that's usually when you go partner with someone like us. And you usually go partner with a direct card issuer. And so you can kind of do that issuer processor, whether it's Marqeta, Stripe Issuing, Lithic, Visa DPS, I2C, etc. You could have a relationship with them, you have a relationship with us. And those are kind of the only two things you need. And that enables you to actually have full control of your program from an onboarding, from a marketing,
Yep.
and from an economics perspective.
And are there things you're able to do around either bin sponsorship or spinning up specific routing numbers for clients that are a little bit different relative to the rest of the ecosystem?
Yeah. So, I mean, in general, yeah, we can do pretty much anything a customer wants, right? Assuming that they have the right team in place. And so, for some of our larger customers, we've done stuff like, give them a dedicated routing number, or, we allow them to actually have high configurability of FedWire and FedACH. And so they can move stuff super quickly. They can do that in an automated way without any errors. Having really fine grained control of this stuff can actually massively affect you in economics as you think about cards, lending, ACH, wires, international, Swift, all this stuff. There's so much nuance there, and there's so much kind of arbitrage you can do that really we just give to our clients in order for them to actually build these sophisticated programs.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good jumping off point. Maybe talk about some of the stuff around like why having more fine grained controls to FedWire matters, especially as you get to scale for some of the later stage fintechs.
Yeah, so like I'll give a recent example is we have a large customer who's doing a huge amount of like inbound wire volume, and they need to figure out like how that actually settles in these large kind of more FBO accounts. So some stuff we can do is we have the concept of you can actually spin infinite account numbers that actually goes into one account. And so they can automatically reconcile, even though it's coming to their account, they can immediately see across a ledger on like, hey, which is which. We also give them access to the direct FedWire message. And so if they want to do their own internal reconciliation, well, there's actually a lot of super useful data that comes in this stuff that normally just gets abstracted away. Because at most of these large banks with wires, it's still a relatively manual process. So there's a lot of fat fingering. There's a lot of just like kind of PDFing that goes along. And if you kind of strip all that away, FedWire is actually a relatively robust protocol. Another kind of example I give is people kind of always think about wires as this like, hey, it runs from like 8 to 3 p.m. Monday through Friday. It's actually not true. Wires, you can actually send 23 hours a day, 6 days a week. Those the hours are actually imposed by the bank because they have manual people that only work 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. But with us, since we have a lot of these automated controls around it, you can actually send and receive wires almost every hour, almost every day. And so for a lot of these businesses, actually from a liquidity perspective and from a speed perspective, it can really change the operating paradigms of the business.
Yeah, I think those are great material examples. So one is, close being able to send wires at almost any time versus to more limited um, points in the day.
Yeah, I'll give like another example is like people always complain about ACH. It's something that we always complain about in the US. We're like, oh my gosh, I wish we had like real time payment systems like in America, like in Europe or something like that, right? Um, we don't. We're getting there, but honestly,
I complain about ACH. I'm
yeah,
one of those people.
it's actually it's not if you actually look at the protocol and you actually look at the speed, it's actually not as bad as people think. And similar to Wire, a lot of the shittiness, shall we call it, of ACH is because of these legacy software providers and all these middleware providers. And so, I'll give an example right now. It's 10:42 out here in California. I can send you an ACH and it'll probably land in your account in the next hour and a half or so. Doesn't matter where we bank at any bank in the US. That's actually not bad. It's actually not 2 days. It's not all this stuff. You can actually send a same day ACH. We utilize all 5 settlement windows. On average, we can get an ACH to you in the next hour or two. It's not real time, but heck, that thing costs like a fraction of a penny. So it's actually not bad. And so actually the whole goal of this, right, is if you strip all the cruft away, look at the actual protocol and actually implement and take advantage of all the nuances around it, we can actually make these things historically having kind of like legacy, we can actually utilize them in a pretty effective way and actually make them quite a bit faster.
Yeah, and that average ACH delivery time of a few hours, and then to your point, if you have fewer middleware providers, you also are probably doing it at lower cost. And if something does go wrong, you have more transparency into it's probably Column's fault, as opposed to like which one of these three people screwed something up along the way, and who do I chase down to get this thing fixed? To your point of ownership and aligning incentives earlier. And backing up to the wire thing too, that's interesting talking about basically spinning up a bunch of virtual accounts for incoming wires that have their own account numbers to make reconciliation a lot easier is something else that you guys can do.
Yeah. So I think, one of the things that we've, you know, when we're able to kind of look at this back from a bit more first principles, we pulled up and we're like, okay, like what is a bank account? What happens is we have this master account at the Fed, and then we can kind of do whatever we want underneath here. And so what we've built this extremely flexible data model that's relatively composable. And you can kind of do whatever you want inside of that, right? And so if we take an individual, whether it be a business or a consumer, then underneath that, the developer or them, they can spin up infinite bank accounts they want. There's no cost to
Yeah.
us, it's just a data model. And then inside of that bank account, right, you can then spin up infinite pointers because an account number is just kind of an abstract concept. It's just like this identifier that gets passed around to the ecosystem. So for us, it's just an ID. So you could have a million pointers to one bank account, or you
Yep.
could have, one pointer to a million bank accounts, right? So you can kind of really reframe this. And with that, it actually, enables a lot of cool use cases. Give another example, we have
No, for sure. Like right now, if you've got 100 companies sending you wires, you just get 100 wires. And you're like, which company does this come from? But if each company who wires you has their own account number, then when the wire comes in, you're like, oh, I know who that came from. Since you know who it came from, you can associate with the invoice. Like all of a sudden you have a level of and then all of a sudden your back office that maybe was trying to do the account reconciliation, you can get rid of some of that sort of. So there's like virtualization of account numbers we've seen as being very helpful for like the ramps of the world and the card space, but virtualization of like bank account numbers, not as much of a thing, although some other people do it as well. So it's great to go deep in some of these specific examples, but just talk through what's kind of the next 12 months look like for a Column and what you're focused on.
Yeah, so we're focused on right now with working with our customers to make sure that their needs are met. So it's really about building that team, expanding our team, building a lot of the process to actually make sure that we can do that at a relatively high velocity. And then working with kind of the largest and most sophisticated customers to do that. Right now, kind of where our primary focus on is our focus is kind of as companies as they get up that maturity. With less focus on companies as kind of like as they're trying to get up to an MVP. Our focus is mostly on like, okay, I have something that's working. I have product market fit. Now I really want to go kind of 100x this. I have the capital. I have the team to go do that. That's really kind of where our sweet spot is. And that's really where we're focused. And we want to make sure that they have like an excellent experience that, we've kind of change this whole paradigm of like working with the bank is a pain in the ass to actually something that is like, hey, this is like a super class A experience, super high touch, has great technology, and we can really partner with them over the next couple of decades. And so, really, over the next 12 months, it's nothing mind blowing. It's really just focused on execution and making sure that our customers have an amazing experience with us.
Yep, makes total sense. And then last question here we ask of all of the founders, which is, what advice do you have for prospective founders, people who are thinking about building something on their own, especially since you're now on your kind of second foray in the land of fintech?
Generally, I would be cautious about taking my advice or any advice you receive. I think, if there's a playbook online to do something, or there's someone's giving advice, all the arbitrage has probably been like, arbed out already. And so I would kind of push people to think a little bit more from first principles. I'm like, hey, what is right for me and what's right for the industry? And I think if we look at fintech historically, kind of as right now, it's a bunch of people building similar stuff to each other. And I think that's kind of proven out in the public markets, and will kind of prove out in the next couple of years, is these business models are not just financially sustainable. And so I think I would push people, especially in financial services. There's a huge amount of opportunity out here. There's still so much to build, but it's probably not going to look exactly like what's been built over the past 5 or 6 years. And so I do really want people to kind of change the way they think about building, change the way they think about product and marketing, and build something for a little bit of a new paradigm.
Yeah, the next decade of great fintech companies is not going to look like the last. Column certainly doesn't look like, very few, if any, of the previous companies. But financial services, still 10% of GDP, still highly underpenetrated from a digital technology, or at least modern technology standpoint. So there's a lot of opportunity out there.
Yeah.
Well, William, thanks so much for joining us. This has been awesome. Could have talked for a lot more time about many different things, but it's been really great having you on the program.
Hey, Rex, thank you for the time. And thanks all your listeners. Bye.